Having a Gas is the podcast that talks to the great and the good of the creative industries, and in particular finds out what makes great music for film, for TV, for commercials, for dancing to, for cooking to, for f***ing to, and more. Today I'm having a gas with Reuben Cohen, a mastering engineer at Lurssen Mastering in Los Angeles. Reuben has worked on dozens of hit records, which is why I wanted to grill him about the technicalities of mastering, which in my opinion is one of the least understood disciplines in audio. There's too many things you've worked on to just list them all because we'd be here all day, but the big hit is, well, there are big hits like Happy by Pharrell, and that's how you came to my attention. In fact, I watched your little Mix with the Masters segment on YouTube, which is very cool.
Sure. Yeah. No, that one, I mean, we get a lot of attention for that single just because it was just this incredible hit. It was number one that summer and stayed number one for so many weeks in 2013, I believe. And everybody loves it because it went so viral. So, and it's a good song to use as an example for mastering because it's, it's a pop song that did so well in those markets, but it's not super slammed with level. It's very much open in terms of its arrangement and its production and all the way from mixing into mastering. So sometimes I like to use that song as a good example of what can be brought with not over pushing something just because people feel like they have to a lot of the time.
Yeah, so when we talk about over pushing, we're not necessarily thinking about the obvious examples from the early part of this century, like, Californication and records like that. But, when I listen to, a playlist like This Is Max Martin on Spotify, and everything is straight to the wall and it's just all the way through. And why is that? How did we end up in a point where records have like no dynamic range?
It's a really good question. And I'm not one to speak up against over or just introducing a lot of dynamic processing because we certainly do it. And when we receive sources that are almost presented that way even before we touch it. And we do it in a musical and tasteful way, I like to think. There's ways to go about this in a really, really great musical way that works out, that feels really great. In other words, I personally, as an audio professional, wouldn't have it any other way. And then there's the other end of the spectrum where you're trying to force something into being in a place that it just wasn't ever produced to be. And that's where we have these diminishing returns and shortcomings. Right. But how do we end up here? To answer your question, Loudness on the immediate flip from before, after, or comparing one thing to another, to the untrained ear will always sound better. It's going to sound bigger, more exciting. It's going to have this, your initial reaction is, okay, well, I'm going to gravitate towards this. So early on, a lot of mastering houses would find that they could get a little bit more business if they could out loud each other. And this was, this had just kind of grew and grew and grew until we ended up where we are. The other thing is that as the listening environments changed from putting on some vinyl and sitting in your living room and watching it spin and having a very captive audience that is in just ingesting this content has changed quite significantly. Now it's on the go. Now we're listening while we're in the car. We're kind of distracted with traffic. There's street noise coming all around us. So compression is a really useful tool to try to push the level up, the average level up, to block out all the noise all around you. So there's many reasons to get loud, incentives rather to get loud. And we've pushed those boundaries, of course, just like anything else in any other field. We've worked up against those, and we've found that there's uses and for that type of thing, and there's also shortcomings. So through all of that, we kind of get better at it. We learn what to do. But certainly, dynamic range, tight dynamic range, dense arrangements is a musical choice. There are genres like EDM, metal, hip hop, R&B, pop. These are the genres that a lot of times it's almost expected to have less of a dynamic range musically because you're going for that impact, you're going for that tightness. It's part of the production, part of the sound.
Right. So there's going to be a lot to go at over the next hour because, in terms of projects where there's a less expectation of dynamic range, you've done a lot of work on soundtrack, and I'm really interested to talk about what mastering means in that domain as opposed to in pop music. But I first always like to have a little bit of a runway as to how you got here, not just how we got here in the industry, but how Reuben Cohen became, someone with a CV, a resume that you have, because respectfully, you appear quite young to have all the experience that you have. So how did you do it?
I started very young. I started as a teenager. right out of, I went to school, music school, went to Musicians Institute. And before I even graduated, I had an internship at the Mastering Lab, and that basically just took over. The Mastering Lab in Hollywood, it's no longer there, but at the time it was on Hollywood Boulevard. And I was an intern. I fell in love with mastering just by showing up and being there. I didn't intend to be a mastering engineer early on. I kind of thought that maybe I'd be a producer or probably a rock star because I was still a teenager. Moved out to LA from Santa Barbara. It's where I grew up. And I just found that I just fell in love with it. I really did. I just didn't want to be anywhere else. I just was completely captivated by what was going on in the studio. I loved the interactions. And Gavin Lurssen, who was working there, kind of saw that I had that spark in my eye, just wanting to just absorb it all. And I think that he probably liked me hanging around in the studio because it kind of, hopefully made things go a little quicker than the opposite. And that was part of the training, learning how to make sure that everything went on course. All the clients were serviced the way they need to be serviced. And then evolving with the evolving industry. So I got very excited early on, and then not too long after that internship, maybe within about a little over a year or so, there was speak of maybe starting another facility. Gavin wanted to start Lurssen Mastering, and he asked me if I would be one of the people that came along with him, and I was very excited to do so. And I was probably about to turn 20 at that time.
Right.
So yeah, that's how it all started. I'll be 35 in a couple months now. So that's really it. I started very young, and just fell in love with it along the way.
And there's a key lesson in what you just said there, which is that you didn't stay wedded to your initial plan of being a rock star. And a lot of people would have had maybe that experience of saying, well, mastering, I thought I was going to be on the vocals or lead guitar, because if you will, there's like a diminishing returns in sex appeal as you go down the post-production chain. You've got rock star, very cool, producer, pretty cool, mix engineer, okay, it's time to get away from it. And then mastering engineers, what's going on? Like, no one is gonna make a statue of a mastering engineer yet. So, there's real value in that. It's like, don't stay wedded to your initial plan, follow where like life appears to be taking you. Yeah,
sometimes life pulls you in different directions, and it's kind of like you just follow where it seems right, and it did. Of course, there's always those situations. There's times, especially when you're young, where you're second guessing your decisions and thinking, well, do I want to turn left or right? And what's the right way? And time kind of figures that all out for you also,
Yeah, definitely.
But for me, like any other job, I'm sure there's peaks and valleys and big successes and big failures, or, things that don't work out the way you were hoping them to work out. I mean, my life's been riddled with that as anybody else, but nobody sees those parts. They only see what actually makes it out to the finished gates.
Yeah. Yeah, 100%. And there's a big push at the moment in the broader culture to be more aware of the troughs as well as the peaks, because we now have Instagram where you can curate your own life to look perfect, and we're becoming more conscious about that. So
yeah.
For the layman in our audience, because I'm sure a lot of people will, hopefully YouTube and things like that pushes this up the algorithm, but a lot of our audience starting out are in the UK advertising industry. And even not only there, but even within music itself, I've always found that mastering is perhaps the least understood of all the disciplines. And in fact, I get people who have made records who still confuse the terms mixing and mastering, which is unusual. So for the layman, how would you describe mastering? What is the essence of what you're doing?
Yes, the essence in what this statement that I'm about to give has changed over time. But what I feel, and this is my own opinion, is that it is whatever you need to do to feel most connected to the music. Once the project is mixed, it's your job to increase that connection, whatever that ends up meaning, in the most effortless way possible, so you as a listener feel most connected to that material, and then know when to walk away and not do anything at all. And sometimes that means doing actually nothing at all. It's pretty rare, because there's always something that we can do in terms of textural feel, especially because we work analog, and so much work is presented digital. Majority, I'd say about 98% now, comes to us digitally. Yeah. So we do offer that, even if we do nothing at all. Just running through our flat chain gives you something. That people often, and it's not flat, it's flat with our flat, right? But there is something there that people end up always loving, even if it's very, very little in terms of adjusting the frequency balance. But what it really is whatever you need to do to increase that connection in its entirety. If there's any more you can do to make that connection more connected, you do it. If not, if you take a step in the other direction, don't do it. And those are the rules to go on. So what does that really mean? That means optimizing the material. And it's sizing up what's presented to you in the mix form. And I'll even digress a little bit and go back. When you're producing a record, for those that might not really understand so much about music production, is you're blending the elements within the arrangement in the mix. You're recording everything, you're choosing your elements, maybe guitar, bass, vocals and drums. If it's a traditional rock band, if it's a virtual, maybe it's a more virtualized arrangement, synthesized, sample-based, you're picking your sounds and you're creating a blend. You're mixing that blend in the mixing process. And if you're mixing to stereo, you're mixing it to two channels, left and right. And then that is printed that way and then presented to a mastering engineer. This is traditionally. Things don't always go this way anymore because everybody, does things differently. But traditionally, you end up in that place and that's your mix. And then you present that to a mastering engineer who's an objective person that hasn't heard this umpty 9 times, completely objective, and is able to introduce their absolute first reaction in terms of what they can do to take it further. And process those 2 channels, let's say we're working in stereo, to optimize them further. Maybe you're working on a single and you're only focused on that one song, or you're working on a number of songs as maybe a compilation from various artists, various producers, or one artist as an album. And now we have to find a certain continuity so it all can live on one canvas. That's a big part of the mastering process. So optimizing it either for itself or to live in conjunction with other material, and then formatting it for release, which is the final step of the mastering process outside of the musical step, is formatting all the various masters. Oftentimes we're making masters specifically for Apple. It used to be called Master for iTunes. Now it's Apple Digital Master. Then we're making a standard digital master, typically 4416, although that's going to change probably sooner than we know. For all the various platforms, Spotify, Google, Amazon, etc. We're still making DDPIs for CD release for those that still want to make CDs, although we're moving out of that more and more every day. And then, of course, high-resolution masters to be cut to vinyl. And then sometimes high-resolution masters just to go out in general, which is Apple's new initiative, which is going to be very exciting. And then also, the services that do playback HD, 96K all the way up to 192, 88.2. These are the higher res formats that are popular.
So, lots to talk about. Let's take some time to indulge the people who might be listening who are really into the tech, let's say the geeks. And I think you were just talking there about formatting. And I think that is, like, of all the things, even within mastering, the least understood. I have no idea the difference between 44.1 and 48. And there was a debate that me and my friends used to have, a vicious debate. 96K doesn't sound different to 44.1. CD sounds better than vinyl, all of this stuff. So what is driving those decisions? And, is there a distinction? Can you hear a qualitative difference?
Absolutely. Well, to all those statements, I 100% agree and 100% disagree at the same time. Yeah. And it's because these things get confusing. It's does CD sound better than vinyl? Well, yes and no, actually. It depends. And then there's many factors even beyond that. How is the vinyl cut and from what source? Is the vinyl just the CD on vinyl, which there's a lot of vinyl that exists out there that simply is the CD format, just then put to it's almost like that's not better necessarily. It's just a storage medium for the CD file. But I suppose where should we start? There's so much to dive into. I guess we can start with sample rate. What is sample rate?
Yeah, let's do that.
Let's do that. So sample rate is digitized audio signal. You can't hear it until it gets converted back to analog. So you have to go through a digital analog converter just to hear it. Otherwise, it's just data. So it's data that is audio analog signal converted to digital that is broken up into little slivers. So in film, we have 24 frames per second. We're pretty familiar with that. That flashes in front of your eyes so quickly that your brain understands it as not flashing light. It understands it as something close to what we experience in reality in me looking in front of you. Actually, I'm not looking in front of you. It's an illusion, but my brain thinks that I am. So with audio, it's the same thing. We're slivering these little samples up, and we can do it we can do it in divide that up in the various fashions. 44.1 is 44,100 samples per second of flashing samples that hits your ear that convinces you that you're hearing something true. And we can go higher and higher than that. We can go to 48,000. We can double 44.1, go to 88.2. We can double 48 and go to 96. And we can go all the way up to 192. And you can even go beyond that. But those are the common ones: 44.1, 48, 88.2, 96, and 192. That has to do with sample rate. Then you have bit depth, which is something different. You have, for every sample, you have a parameter in terms of how many bits are responsible for each sample. 16 bits or 24 bits. And I believe every bit is responsible for 8 dB of dynamic range. So if you have more than 16 bit, if you have 24 bit, it's that much more dynamic range that's allocated per sample. So really, really low level stuff. It's very important in orchestral arrangements where you have big peaks and then tiny little quiet passages that are almost, you can't even hear them even when you're monitoring full level before you would hit that floor, which would then get lopped off at 16 bit. And that's where we have to introduce dither and stuff, so you don't have to get into truncating and all of that. So I don't, like I said, these are you can go pretty far down the rabbit hole explaining all the technical ends of things, but in a nutshell, that's what sample rate and bit depth is.
And that's when, if you're the typical bedroom producer running stuff off and you're going, what should it be, 4824 or 44.116? Would you say at a certain level there's no value in distinguishing between those things?
Well, here's where I would, there's many things to consider. You have to consider why you're going above 44.1, and then you're also having to consider how you're going to release this to the world, and do you have to start introducing sample rate conversion? Because sample rate conversion outweighs, in my opinion, going up. In other words, if you're going to 96K, but you have to end up at 16-bit 44, you have to weigh out, is it worth it to have to go through a sample rate conversion if you're working digitally, right? Because just going through a sample rate conversion can introduce, depending on what converter you use even too, can introduce a whole lot of loss. So is it worth it? Now, in my opinion, generally it is, especially because we master analog. So if somebody mixes and records and mixes rather a 96K song, and I play it back, I'm playing it back and converting that signal from digital to analog at 96K, high res. And then on the back end, I can record in at whatever sample rate without any sample rate conversion I choose. Direct feed, which is another another benefit to going to analog is that you can bypass sample rate conversion and get a clean shot right in. And then I can reset my capture machine to 96 and do a separate print just for 96. So no sample rate conversion at all. And I'm not a fan of sample rate conversion, really. So there's that. But sample rates, they're important, but they're not the most important thing. There's the more important thing is technique. How good is the integrity of your recording? How good are you at recording? Or who have you involved in your project that can bring your recording to where it needs to be? Those decisions greatly outweigh the difference between somebody listening to 48 versus 44.
So the conclusion to derive from that is, if we're squabbling, as me and one of my friends used to, I regret to say, if we're squabbling over 44 versus 96, really we're putting the cart before the horse and we're not thinking about music, which is the important thing.
I would say so. Yeah. I'd say that there's certainly, in my opinion, and I get to cheat because I got really nice speakers that reveal that a lot easier than, let's say, an Apple earbud, Can you really hear, could my grandmother hear the difference between 96K and 44? She probably wouldn't be able to hear it on here, but... Yeah. And let alone the Apple earbuds, I would, but this is my world, Yeah. But it's a subtle thing, and it's almost a feel thing more than anything, because what it is it's closer to analog, it's closer to full resolution signal, and what I mean by that is that at some point, well beyond what we can consciously hear, there is a cutoff point with digital in terms of the ultra harmonic frequency spectrum. It does lop off, and it lops off at a higher point at 96 than it does at 44. but it lops off nevertheless. If you're listening to a true analog recording, maybe it's 1970s vinyl that was recorded analog and cut analog, and there hasn't been any digital intervention. And you play it on a turntable, and you're playing direct analog through analog speakers. That is an experience where there is no lop off.
There's no loss.
Signal. It's similar to being in my experience, it's as pure as listening to a cellist in a hall playing in front of you. It's the closest we have to that in recorded medium. Whenever you go to digital, you've lost that, because no matter what you do, you're lopping off the ultra harmonic frequency spectrum, and you're at the mercy of the integrity, even under the best of circumstances, of that converter and how you're playing it back. So it creates a subtle stress on the brain when you do that. Very, very subtle, because the brain needs to compensate for that loss, and it does it unconsciously. Mm-hmm. So these are the things to think about. If you're going for a certain arrangement that the intent of that is to be just completely pure, and you're a purist in your pursuit of that, then you want to start thinking about these things. If you're making an EDM song, it's probably going to be the last thing on your mind, because you're already in the digital world. All your elements are already digital. So you're completely thinking about something different. So with this argument of digital versus analog, there's so much more than just this black and white type of comparison. It's really much, what are you trying to achieve? What's the music that you're working on? All of these things need to be thought of. That's
two questions that come straight to front of mind from that is, so one is, I had the benefit of grabbing a great number of my dad's vinyls from the 70s from his collection, because he was in the I'm washing out all of my irrelevant old media, I'm going straight to digital. So I was like, I'll have all the vinyl, thanks. I've got an original copy of What's Going On, Marvin Gaye, and we put that thing on and we turn it up, and we're all sat in my house going, why is that so good? I have no idea. And it's all to do with this phenomenon you described of analog to analog to analog to analog. There's been no interruption between Marvin singing and it coming out of my speakers.
Yes, and under the best of circumstances. Now, there are some beautiful recorded analog, digital. Now you can only listen to it digital recordings. And, a lot of times I reference this one album that we did, the Punch Brothers, the Phosphorescent Blues. The arrangements are like, where do you go from here? It's just, you don't go anywhere beyond this for what they are doing, the musicianship, the mixing, everything, the way it was recorded, it sounds so pure and analog. And yet you have to listen to it as an MP3 on the digital platforms right now. Nevertheless, I'm still, as a music person that enjoys music and with ears that are spoiled, I still enjoy it, and I can still feel connected to it. So, success.
Yeah, of course. So, I also wanted to get one more bit of really intense digital geekery out of this when you were talking about the ultra harmonic frequency spectrum. And just as a shot in the dark, I recently watched, I think it was another mix with the masters. It was the dude who mastered Kendrick Humble. And he put a relatively significant boost on 22,000 hertz. Yes. And I was thinking, I can't even hear 17,000 at my age, and I'm 28. What's that even going to do? And is that ultra harmonic frequency, is that what we're thinking about, or?
Yes and no, and I know what you're referring to, and that's a common technique actually from various mastering studios. Doug would do something like that too. Gavin's mentor, and early on in my career, we used to do stuff like that. Half dB at 22K and stuff like that. It's not that we can't hear this. It's a musical technique because it allows for some air. Some shine, but that doesn't just mean that when you're doing something like that and introducing EQ globally, you're not just affecting 22, you're affecting the entire frequency spectrum. You're affecting the bottom by doing that too. Everything is interrelated with everything else. And I think you would hear it, if you were in this room and I boosted 22 and we A/B between the two, you'd pick it.
Well, that was the frightening thing. Even on watching this video, I was like, I can hear the difference, but I don't know why, because I can't hear 22,000 hertz. My ears are rolled off at that point.
Everything is being lifted towards that. If I boosted 20 hertz, everything would be kind of shifting towards that. So that's, I love to do that type of thing in the frequency spectrum. I think of the frequency spectrum that way. So, as I'm if I'm working on an arrangement, sometimes I like to boost 120 because it lifts the bottom upwards to create some support. And then I can use that bottom as my support to then lift higher up around 6K. And now I've got this thing where it feels supported and more open. So it blooms in all directions, but I'm EQing that shape into compression, which also has a shape. And I'm working all these shapes in juxtaposition against each other to create this thing that feels like in the end that I didn't do anything at all, but it feels like this big bloomed flower, if you will.
Yeah. And that's really a profound revelation in some sense, because when we're, younger engineers, less experienced people, in my experience, tend to think of EQ in a very, what would you call it, a very stripy, surgical way. All hats are at the top, just kicks are at the bottom. In the middle, somewhere you've got vocals and you've got, some stuff, you got electric piano at 500 or whatever. So we think that instruments just sit in narrow bands, but like what you're describing, they're all across the whole thing.
Yes, and this is the type of perspective that I had going in as a young engineer, that it's almost like the idea of playing checkers versus chess, As you get more experienced, you kind of start thinking, well, if I do this, that, and the other, it allows me to then do this, that, and the other, versus let me not do too much, let me just do this and that. And the analogy I like to use is in mastering, a lot of times people think of, the first thing we do is listen to a mix and think about, okay, what's wrong with this? And
what
it's
can I
almost
change?
Or just like, hey, what can I correct? Because what's, needs correcting. And I never think about it that way anymore. And I haven't for so long. It's much different. It's immediately hearing to what is in front of you and projecting in your mind's eye where it could be. And then plotting that journey from point A to point B. And rather quickly, actually, I find I do my best work if I throw it up there, maybe 90% up on the board very quickly. And then the last 10% takes the actually most of the time.
Yeah, and that's the traditional curve of any project, isn't it? It's like a load of progress gets made right here. And then, if you think of that moment maybe as the week that the band could afford to record in the studio, that's when most of the progress got made, let's say. But yes. Let's talk about Happy for a moment, because we touched on that at the beginning. Sure. And, now we've established a lot of what your practice is and how you approach it. We can dive back in, because you mentioned that Happy is it's a dynamic song that bops, the snare sticks right out. And if that was, obviously I would never get that brief, but if that was me, I'd be like, all right, I'm going to pull my Waves L2, smash that snare back down to where everything else is. Take us through the process. How do you approach a hit like that?
Well, so much is communicated with no communication at all for me personally, in terms of what to do when I receive a mix. I really, for doing this as long as I have, and just doing it every day as consistently as I have, so much information is passed just by listening to what's presented to me, because I've heard every type of way something can be presented, really, really dense, hard hitting stuff that's mixed by certain people, and stuff that's left more open and dynamic. And the communication, it's like, oh, I know why you went down that road. That makes sense to me. I can hear that musically. I understand intuitively what your musical decisions are. Therefore, I'm going to process it this way. And it's not like I'm, this comes through experience too, because I've done this so many times. I kind of know what somebody's going to say based off what I send them. Mm-hmm. They're going to either say this, that, and the other. And over time, you kind of realize, okay, well, maybe when I receive mixes this way, I should treat them this way. There's a whole bunch of that. But when I received that mix that Leslie did, he didn't even have to get me on the phone. I already caught his wave. I kind of got where he was going. And then it's no surprise to me. I kind of expected him to have the reaction of, oh, this sounds great. Thank you for not stepping on my mix, because probably maybe somebody with less experience would try to impress somebody and try to get a whole bunch of hype, where it wasn't mixed for that. It was mixed for a particular feel, and you have to catch that wave and ride it. Right. Yeah. I find that if, and maybe, early on, you're worried a bunch, when you're trying to impress your clients. Oh, I better do this because I don't want to lose the opportunity, or this and all of that. All of that angst takes you away from doing your best work. It takes you away from the music right from the get-go. You're just launching from the wrong place. You got to, as you get more comfortable and confident in this process, let all of that slide to the background, and you let the music do all the speaking. In fact, the less thinking you do, the better, I find. And you just operate off pure instinct. and I've proven this to myself time and time again. I'll do a record where I will second guess my decisions, come back the next, and not send it out because it's not ready to be sent out yet. Still have another day or two. Come back the next day, no pressure. Just do it. Oh, that's the one. Always the one. It's always going to beat it because it's coming from a musical place, not a analytical, concerned, second guessing type of place.
Yeah, there's a really nerdy metaphor I've been using to describe that a lot recently, which is Luke turning off his targeting computer in Star Wars: A New Hope. It's like, stop trying to measure, predict, and rationalize. Just goes in the ears, feel, your response, act upon that feeling, move on.
It's the best tool we have. And that can be strengthened like any other thing. Your technical tools can be strengthened, but also your intuitive confidence can be strengthened. And I find that is when it's like the same thing as going on stage. You watch somebody going on stage, like you watch Steven Tyler go on stage. That guy can't miss. He's not going to miss because he's in the zone. He's in the groove and he's in the flow of it. He's in his flow state. And you find somebody else that maybe is on American Idol, and maybe at home in front of their family, they're in their flow state, but they go up on stage and they're nervous as all hell and they're not, and they don't deliver. And that can happen to anybody, So in any field, I think, any creative field.
It's interesting that you talked about what we could call developing your inner client, knowing what someone is expecting just by reading the mix they've sent over. But one of the things that I'm not so sure about is, are you only serving the mix engineer, or do you also have label pressure?
The labels, funny enough, very, very rarely weigh in on these types of things. They trust the producers, the mixers, and frankly, they trust us to deliver something right. And there's a lot of, we have to maintain that trust. And that's part of our responsibility to everybody involved. But I think maybe what you're asking is, if there's more than one chef in the kitchen, how do you appease contradicting arguments, right? And that is not always the easiest thing, especially if more than one person trying to pull something in more than one direction. We as mastering engineers need to always give and put out something that is responsible and good for the music. We don't ever want to compromise the music negatively because somebody thinks that they want something to sound like something else. We have to stand up against that. So we do fight that fight, and that is how we develop that type of trust. Because we have integrity behind what we do, and very rarely if we are in a situation where somebody says, "Hey, I want something," and we know that we're not putting something out that's right, we'll have to say, well, we might not be the best people to work on this. It's very, very rare that happens.
It's rare, and when obviously Lurssen is well established now. I imagine at the beginning of a business career, particularly if you're a new studio that doesn't have any like legacy clients, if you started a studio now, you would have legacy clients, right? And it's like, if you're just in the game, you are going to want to impress everyone and never argue, and you're going to want to take every piece of business. And if they say, just make it louder, you're going to be like, yep, sure thing, I'm going to slam that limiter. So, does that take a long time to develop that confidence to, have to know that you are the expert and that's what you've been paid for?
Well, I was inspired by Gavin because Gavin just took this stance that maybe he got the confidence from Doug. So we all banded together. I mean, when the loudness wars, level wars were happening, Doug didn't buy into that ever. He was always doing what he did. He would always do the best choices for the music. That was the integrity that he had. And maybe certain clients that were trying to compete with somebody else would go elsewhere, but the people that trusted in the integrity behind the music would continue to hire him, and he developed a reputation for that. And Gavin followed suit. Gavin went for music first, and I was certainly inspired by that, and I went for music first. That being said, we have gotten very good at living in all worlds. We can hit stuff really, really hard if that's the musicality that we need to go for that particular production. And like I said, we wouldn't have it any other way, because I mean, I could talk for an hour just on level, but we are at service at the same time. We have to be at service. These are not our albums. They're not our projects. We are at service to the artists, but we play in as part of that. We're playing into guiding that process also. We have to have that trust. And that means kind of taking all these things into account and making the best decisions.
Let's take a few minutes just to talk about level there, because one question I would have would be, does everything have to hit 0 dB anymore, or have we moved on?
Well, 0 dB is this invisible ceiling that's now in a relative place because of the way the streaming platforms are normalizing everything down. So, when we're working up against digital zero is the same for everybody. It doesn't matter if you're working with us or you're working in your bedroom, in Pro Tools or GarageBand or anything in between. Digital zero is digital zero. So we're all working up against the same digital confines. And some people say, oh, well, that's too bad because now we have to deal with this thing that will distort. And I say, fantastic. It's something to work up against. And that's the way I've always processed audio. People think that, at least for me, mastering is I'm working up against that digital ceiling as something to work up against musically, because that is something to kind of push and use dynamic processes as a musical thing to work up against. And it has everything to do with density. So loudness is equal to density. It's the same thing. The more dense something is, the more loud it is. Even if it gets lowered, it has that loud potential because you can just turn it up on your car stereo a little louder and it's going to come up louder. So if somebody for mastering and they say, what level should I leave it at? I say the actual level is actually, it doesn't matter at all. What matters is your density. Because I could just turn it down digitally 3 dB and now I've got 3 dB of headroom. That's not 3 dB of headroom. It's 3 dB of nothing, right? What it is, your headroom is your peak to average ratio. How dense is your average level versus your peak level? And that's all loudness is.
So you could say, look at your peak imagine your peak is always zero. That's just the ceiling.
Well, it doesn't have to be. Generally speaking, it is. If you're, on most things, I'm limiting. If I am limiting, I'm limiting directly below zero. Minus a tenth or so, and then all my musicality is based off of where that is. I ship a master out that way. If it gets then lowered on the platforms, the musicality is baked in that way. That's okay. So trying to be as loud as anybody else is actually oftentimes the last thing you want to do. You're going to end up with something that's very loud and small because it's being turned down more on the platforms. And if the platforms don't turn it down, somebody listening back will turn it down on the volume knob. Last thing you want is to have your really aggressive, exciting recording being turned down, which will happen because human beings have the ability to turn things down. What you don't want is that, so you want to, if you're going for maximum size, maximum impact, you want to deal with what you're presented and take that to the finish line in its best place. And that has everything to do with how it's presented, everything to do with how the mix is mixed, how everything, how loud the vocal is relative to everything else will completely have so much bearing on how much level can be realized or how much size can be realized is what I should say. If the vocal's a little loud, the track underneath the vocal is going to sound a little small. If the vocal's a little quiet, you're going to have a much bigger sounding track. So all of these, something so simple as that is going to have way more of influence over where we end up at the end.
Wow. That's, we were mixing a TV project recently, like a sort of 23-minute documentary, and relativity comes into it a lot. So we have voiceover is usually the loudest thing, right, when you're mixing for TV. And then we enter a bit of voiceover and then a long transition period where it's mostly music, and the music sits somewhere like here, compared to the voiceover. And once if you punch into the session at the point where you've got music, then the next voiceover comes in, you go, whoa, that seems really, really loud, and you turn it down. Is that kind of an analog to what we're talking about here? It's like relativity is the issue. Relativity is everything in our world, everything. So absolutely, and you're dealing with, when you're a mastering engineer listening to things, you're listening to how everything's interrelating with everything else. Sort of almost as a mixer, but not as a mixer, because you're listening to the global and you're understanding how you're introducing processing for introducing into the global. So yeah, everything is relative to everything else. What's your opinion of people who master their own mixes? Is that advisable or inadvisable, or is that just not a specific enough question? It could be the not enough specific enough question, and it really depends on how these people are mastering their own mixes. And one of the first questions I have when somebody brings in something is, this happens quite a bit, where I'll have two files, one with the full processing on the bus as maybe the artist heard, and without, or with less, maybe without the limiter. And my first question 100% of the time is, what is your mix?
Is it option A or is it option B? Because it could be either one. Maybe
it's not as simple as the mix is just the mix with no bus processing. It's not that simple. It's
certainly not that simple. And this is one of the biggest topics of great confusion that a lot of my colleagues, we after work, we'll not so much in COVID times, they're more Zoom hangs, but we'll talk about this type of thing because there is a great amount of confusion about this topic. And here's how it came by. Mixers would mix without having to think about level for a long time because they would depend on their mastering engineers to take it there. And oftentimes as they were mixing, the only time the artist would even hear the mix is when they were there at the studio. Sometimes they'd get a CD to listen to, but really the way they were really hearing it for the first time was at the very end, once it was already mastered to a large degree. That's when they were really making the final judgments. And that's completely changed over a long time. And people our mixing engineers are in a position where they have to deliver something in order to keep the gig that is already sounding fairly done. So that introduces a wrench in their world. And this 10 years ago, they were mixing without trying to achieve any type of level necessarily. They were just trying to get to a appropriate level, their preferred level as mixing engineers. But to get their artist approval, they'd slam a limiter. They put a limiter on post their mixing process, and the artist would only hear that. And then they might have notes on that, or there's some back and forth, but they never really heard the mix that was presented for mastering. So what a mastering engineer would receive is two sets of files, or if it's a single, two files for the single. One as the mix was, just the way the mix heard it, just the way the mixer prepared it and did it. And then another file that is not quite their mix, but it's what the artist has been living with. So when it comes to mastering, you wouldn't want to use that as your source. You'd want to use this as your source, because that's the real true mix that has all the musicality just the way the mixer left it. And that source is going to yield the best thing for the end results. Now, fast forward, things get a little bit more tricky. And we're now in a world where mixers are mixing into the processing a little bit more, or maybe 80% of the way through, they put on this limiter. Maybe it's not just a limiter, maybe it's compression, EQ, limiting, combination of various processes all working. Sometimes multi-band compression. Anyway, they're mixing into this processing that is on the bus. And all of their musical decisions, all of their decisions are based off what is coming out of the speakers. So all of their balances are completely influenced by this thing. But time for mastering, let's take it off. Well, what is this at this point? It's subject to whatever you had on the bus. So the question is, why would you take that off? This is not your mix at all. This is your mix. Well, maybe let's take off just the limiter. Well, maybe. Depends on what that limiter is doing. Is it doing a lot? Is it really, really doing a lot of work, or is it doing something very little? So these are the things that we have to determine, and everybody does it differently. So a lot of the times I'll use this one as the source because that in fact is their mix. This is useless at this point. And this is the start of this great confusion, because it has everything to do with how that mixer prepared their mix. And there is no one way to do it. There's a million ways to do it.
Yeah, that's interesting actually, because I often, will do a mix and then do an arbitrary bus process after the mix, and not mixing into it, but do a kind of, I'll take some of the very, very low frequencies off and then maybe put an SSL compressor on and see what that does, and then an L3 and pull it down to 0. And it's, and this is an admission of great foolishness on my part. So it's really, it's interesting to know that mastering engineers can prefer to hear what your bus processing is, because it's all influencing the mix. And I've definitely been guilty of that before, of just, mixing into bus processing, turning it off, and then just sending that to the mastering engineer. I suppose for the less experienced people in our audience, you might say the analogy would be shooting a film with an orange filter on it and then just taking the filter off in post and being like, cool, it looks completely different now.
Absolutely. That's a good analogy. It's really that. You want to 9 times out of 10 use what the mixer did, even if they mix through processing, because that is in fact their mix. Without that, it's not the same. Now, removing some limiting or turning down the threshold of the limiter sometimes can introduce something, but and that's why it's sometimes nice to have more than one, one option. But these are the types of things we go into, and here's where you're between a rock and a hard place, is when somebody's overdone it and they've mixed into it. But they know they've overdone it too. They're not even happy with it. They're saying, well, I just hope that you can do a better job instead of what I had on the bus. But what the thing that they're missing is they're married to it at that point. Their mix is completely dependent on that. They can't undo that, or I have to redo it another way. And even just doing that, you're already kind of starting off from, the analogy to use is Humpty Dumpty fell off the wall. I can glue it back together, but you're always going to see the cracks, Yes. I might glue it together better. This is the other thing. Sometimes removing that process, we have this type of scenario where somebody mixes to their liking, right? And then they throw something on for their artist only, but now the artist has a whole bunch of notes, and this thing's gone back and forth so many times it's lost its way. Taking it off at that point is subject to all of that back and forth. So sometimes projects go down that road too, in which case you have to make some decisions, because I might introduce all of this beautiful processing on my end to make it bloom and to ride choruses, to give you that excitement. But inherently, there's 2% of there that's not quite, that's got lost because somebody took something off at some point that was part of their musical balances. And so at that point, you have to make the best decisions you can, because remixing is not an option, and you have to take all of those things into account. And even though you're putting out something that is the best it can be, there is somewhere along the lines a hair of compromise. And so our job at that point is to talk about it and to make some decisions based off what we have at that point, even if it is salvaging something, even those tiny degrees of salvaging what happened. The alternative is that this music's not going to be released and nobody's going to hear it. So these are the things we get into. These are the things we have to decide. And the best thing we can do is continue to educate people on their processes, so they make the best decisions for themselves, even if that means not using us for any mastering engineer at all, or preparing something and really utilizing us for what we can offer in the best way.
But the issue you described at length there is also worthwhile. It's worth noting. In the creative industries, it's unavoidable that at some point you're going to have to be attempting to salvage a sinking ship, and you won't be able to pull your hair out about, if only it was optimal, if only this mistake hadn't happened. So I mean, you described a bit of it, but I assume that's quite rare in your case.
Very rare. Most of the time these issues don't come up. What's most important is we know. The biggest issue is we know what happened, because a lot of times the artist will just send in one file and the producer's on to the next job. So we have to say, no, artist, wait a second, what happened? Let me talk to your mixing engineer. Let's just make sure we get everything the way we should. And so educating people when they come to us on, and then maybe kind of doing some further digging in terms of where these files ended up in their hands, and just making sure we have the right thing to work from is so much now actually a big part of our job, more than ever. But people that are good generally end up sticking around. Producers that are good at what they do, work creates more work. If they're good, they're doing good things for the right reasons. They end up sticking around. We get those mixes from them, and there's not problems from them. Even if they do have, a significant amount of bus processing in it on their mixes, great. That's their musicality. That's what they presented. No reason to not use that as a source, as long as you can, as long as you're not conscious of the confines of that processing. In other words, as long as you're not hearing those transients stop against the ceiling. You're not hearing the hardness of those transients. You're not hearing the negative aspects of that processing. You're in good shape, because so much of what we can do is to remove that veil in a way. I listen for, am I conscious of that ceiling? Because I never, ever want to put out anything ever that I'm conscious of a ceiling on. And I have ways of EQing to make that ceiling less apparent, even if it's already there. I can kind of uncompromise something in mastering a lot of the times if I have to do that.
Are you familiar with Yoad Nevo?
I don't know that I am, actually.
Yeah, he's a mix engineer. He does a lot of wave stuff on YouTube. But
yes, I am actually. Yes.
Yeah, and we did a podcast with him recently, which was daunting at first because he's very, you don't get a lot of feedback initially, but his wisdom is deep. He knows a lot of stuff, and he said two things that I'd love to get your take on. One was what you were sort of maybe describing there. He said, either you're controlling the situation or the situation is controlling you. Mm-hmm. And that pertains to this, salvaging things that aren't maybe working.
Yeah, we have to make the best decisions for not just everybody involved, the artists, the integrity behind the music. What it comes down to is we have to make the best decisions for the music. That's the simplest way. And whatever that means, And usually it's very clear what that decision needs to be. So we do that. Yeah.
And then the other one was this won't be true in your case because you've not been alive long enough, but he said mastering is often taking 25 years of experience and condensing it into half dB moves.
Oh, yeah. I'd say way less than that. Fractions of a tenth. Fractions of a tenth is way more apparent in our world, especially if we're dealing with very dense arrangements. You know, when you're dealing with a dense compressed material, those fractions of a tenth of a dB are very audible. When you're dealing with something a little bit more open and loose, they're a little less audible. So yes, absolutely. This is a game of inches, and beyond even that, it's feel. It's the integrity of the quality of the audio. This is where we get deep and down the rabbit hole. Is how does it just feel? You know, does it feel pure? Does it feel effortless, or does it feel processed? And is that process working for you musically or working against you? These are the things to become sensitive to and attuned to, so you can guide yourself through all of these different ways you can go down these paths. Yeah,
like I'm sure you remember about 10 years ago, it was about 10 years ago now, which is frightening. We had the period where Skrillex became really popular and brought into being that genre of music writ large. And a huge feature of it was going from 0 dB to minus infinite in the space of like half a second.
Right.
And, you know, it could sound like an error if you were in a different genre, but like you're saying, that genre demanded that you slam it that way because that was what was appealing.
Absolutely. That's part of it. It's part of it. And there's good slammed in that world, and there's bad slammed in that world, you know? And there's everything in between, you know. His productions have always sounded very, very impressive to me, you know? So it's no question that he would lead the charge in a lot of ways, especially at that time, you know, and I remember all of that. But sometimes, you know, it really has to do with, does somebody push something beyond where it musically feels like it wants to be? And you let the music guide you. You got to let the music guide you.
So let's take a moment to talk about motion picture, because, you know, I've seen from your resume here, the first one that you mentioned is working on the soundtrack of Slumdog Millionaire, which I have to mention because we're in Manchester and that's made by Danny Boyle, one of our Mancunian heroes. So, you know, talk about how different it is working on motion picture to working on a pop record. And by the way, I'm guessing, is that why you've got a huge screen in your studio?
Well, so what we're doing is the soundtrack releases. That goes on Spotify, iTunes. Sometimes the songs occasionally, once mastered, goes into the film. But generally the score music doesn't, because the score music is often produced not for stereo. Back then it was mixed to 5.1. Now it's being mixed to Atmos, which I could spend another hour talking about. But when it comes to us, it's being repurposed for stereo release, generally speaking, for the platforms. When Slumdog came out, this was pre-Spotify. So the priority was, it's probably, still platforms, but it was Apple Music and CD, you know, that's what we were doing it for. So it's mixed down to stereo specifically for the soundtrack release. And then we're optimizing it for the screen back there is only to see Pro Tools bigger.
Oh,
not
wow.
To see the film. Yeah.
Yeah, and also, is that like, is there anything special about that screen? Is it like not reflective or something? Is it acoustically appropriate or?
Well, we tune the room around it being down, you know, so it doesn't bother me. It actually, now I'm used to the room that way. If I put it up, the room sounds not right to me. So yeah. It's like anything else. If I took the couch out of the back of the room would certainly not sound right to me.
Oh yeah, 100%.
But this couch is not acoustically treated. It's just a couch.
Yeah. Me and Eric Valentine went down a rabbit hole on that when he came on the podcast, and you know, because we've just got I won't mention, we've not signed off on it yet, but we just got a very good acoustics company to quote us for the 2 studios in here, because I don't know if you can see, but the walls are pretty bare, so mixing in here is a nightmare. Mm-hmm. Then we come up with the issue of, but we still like to have a huge TV screen there. So it sounds like you're saying, you know, if you've got the screens and it's an integral part of your process, make sure they're in when you're treating the room.
Yeah, there's some arguments about that. You know, people, you know, can shoot rooms and try to get them as flat as possible. We tune rooms by our ears. We spend a lot of time doing it. We listen. We do sweeps also to reconfirm what we're hearing, because that's very informative. We move the speakers back and in a couple inches or a foot and move them forward. We learn the room based off that. We change our listening positions. All of these things go into tuning rooms, and your ears are personal to you. Gavin and I, thankfully, hear the same way. it's probably because I grew up being mentored by Gavin. So I probably just got used to that temperature, and it came from the mastering lab too, so we like to tune our environments to give us the best window and porthole to the world. And that is subject to a personal preference. We walk into other mastering engineers' rooms and be like, well, how do you even understand what this is? And they probably have the same experience if they listen to how it all sounds balanced, but it's balanced in their own way,
Yeah.
So I don't, personally like a very hi-fi tweeter. I find that I prefer a more dark, growly speaker.
What are you using right there? What have you got?
These are ATC 150s, and that's the same speaker I've used my entire career.
Yeah, so you trust that?
I do, yeah. And I'm just, it's just very familiar to me. It's my porthole.
Yeah. It's always interesting to get this kind of perspective from the pros, because we're a very small and very new business in the grand scheme of things. We're about 5 years old, and none of us when we joined had any significant industry experience. So we're really building from the bottom up. And the other engineers and we can often fall into the trap of imagining there's some objectivity. I talked to Andrew Sheps about this as well, saying that there's such a thing as the perfect room. There's not. There's your room. It's all taste.
Absolutely. Yep. And you talk to anybody in our fields, they'll all agree with that. Every room sounds a little different. There is no perfect room. There is no perfect brain. There's no perfect ear. It's all just you and your experience and your decisions. That's all there is.
Yeah. I mean, the big thing we're coming up against at the moment is we've been using these Genelecs for years, but they sound huge. They produce this really flattering sound. We're in the market now for something that's a bit more, I don't know, that sounds like speakers that people listen to music on, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. And, there's so many, there's how that speaker integrates with that room. You can very quickly dismiss a speaker for saying that's a bad speaker, but is it interacting with that room? It's completely tied to that. So I've heard these ATC sound horrible when not properly in the right position. And you could quickly dismiss any speaker if it's not. And then, but once we get them integrating with the room and, dialing everything in, now they sound like the most amazing thing you've ever heard in your life. So these are the things.
Let's briefly, because we've just about to come up on the hour, but let's talk about life outside of work. And on the musical side for you, do you still actually, you started as a musician. Do you still make any music? Do you get any of that done?
Just for my own therapy.
Yeah.
I use music now to wind myself down from the day. I'll just go on the couch and play guitar. That's my musical, I don't know, that's what I use it for. But my girlfriend and we write fun songs for people as gifts now. We'll do that type of thing. I find that, so no, that's what I like to do. But mastering is a lot of musical energy too. It takes a lot of musical energy out of you to do it every day. And you have to maintain that like anything else, get enough sleep and eat right and all of that so you have more to put out. So I find that I have enough for mastering.
Yeah.
It's a lot of work.
Oh, God, yeah. We definitely found that because, full disclosure, our business is we compose music for advertising in the UK, basically. And I used to be, before I was kind of, significantly involved with the business, used to have this kind of naivety that it's like, right, I'm going to work all day, and then the evening is going to be when I produce my own stuff. And if you're listening all day, you're done.
Yes. I'm listening to podcasts on the way home, put it that way.
Yeah. Who do you enjoy listening to?
I listen to, a lot of different people, but probably just because he's got great guests, I listen to the Joe Rogan podcast a lot.
Joe Rogan, number one. Yeah. Well, that's exactly why it's not exactly why this came about, but this was a lockdown project initially. Like March comes around, suddenly there's no work to do. So got to do something, right? So this was that. So, So Reuben Cohen, thank you for talking to me for the last hour. And I hope if there's any mastering pros or aficionados who end up listening to this or watching this, I apologize if my questions were not down the rabbit hole far enough. But you've done other stuff, haven't you? Like your mix with the masters, where you really go in depth on the tech. Yeah.
And we also have a YouTube channel too, where we go even further down. If you check us out, Lurssen Mastering YouTube, do all kinds of demonstrations and talk philosophy. Both Gavin and I. So certainly anybody that's more on that side of things, they might enjoy that.
Great stuff. Oh, and one final thing I'll say, how is business looking, pandemic-wise? Has it affected it at all? Or?
You know, when it first hit, I think the whole world was thinking, where's this going to turn? And everybody felt it because the whole world came to a grinding halt. But thankfully, it seems like we're back to normal again. So, you know, we're blessed to feel that way. But yeah, I think we're back to our normal rhythms at this point.
Great stuff. Well, long may it continue.